Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the third partner workshop of the cleverly named Oregon NFIP Biological Implementation Planning Work Group. We should come up, Erin, with some kind of clever acronym before this whole project is up. Thanks for joining us. It's August. We know people are on vacation if they can figure out a way to do that. We know folks have a lot of priorities drifting around if you're not on vacation, and so thanks very much for joining us today. I'm going to introduce, as I always do, our agency colleagues who you can see on video here, I think for the most part at least. Erin Cooper from FEMA. Erin, you want to wave to the crowd? Kate Wells from NOAA Fisheries. Hi, Kate. And Celinda Adair from Oregon DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development. This is the agency team, along with other colleagues, John Graves from FEMA and Matt Krall from DLCD amongst them, that are kind of at the core of this effort to figure out a route to implementation of the Oregon NFIP biological opinion. My other colleagues with me today here, who you may also see, Zach Hughes from Salus Resources, myself, Sarah O'Brien, I'm Executive Director of Willamette Partnership, and my colleague, Emily Irish, the partner for communications at Willamette Partnership, is managing all of our technology and various bells and whistles here today. So it looked to me like from the registration list, most of you had joined us for these workshops in the past. We're going to start out with a little bit of background for folks that might be new, and then dive into a great deal of content today. Here's our intention and our objectives for the meeting today. It's going to feel possibly like more than one meeting today. It's a bit of a marathon, and so stick with us. We'll give you a solid break in the middle, but we've been hearing from folks a couple of different things. One is that it's time to back up and clarify. Perhaps we have not been completely clear about the intent or the process of what we've been working on the last couple of months here. So we'll do a little bit of that. As you all know, and hopefully contributed some ideas, we've been working on a virtual flip chart remotely and electronically since the last meeting. I want to share the results of that virtual flip chart conversation so far, and also have a discussion on paths to BiOp implementation that Erin will lead us through, kind of some potential different paths that might take. And finally, as we always do, end on an outline of next steps and opportunities for engagement that can give you an idea of where we're headed next in this process. As I said, may feel like a bit of a marathon. We have a lot of content to get through today, but one of the things we've been hearing a lot from folks is that A, we want to get into the nuts and bolts, and B, let's get moving and get to the nuts and bolts already. So today is the day when we're going to try to share enough nuts and bolts to try to get to a shared understanding, a body of knowledge that we can really sit down and have a robust conversation around. And we'll share a little bit more detail on this a little bit later. But we'd like to spend the next month and a half really diving into some smaller group discussions. We've just concluded that the format of a 50 or an 80-person webinar is just not a great way to dive into nuts and bolts. And so we're trying to build a shared platform of knowledge here and then break up into some smaller group conversations over the next several weeks. So we're trying to get to where we need to do that. A couple of little technical details. Please remain on mute unless we call on you and offer to unmute you. You can have your video on. You can have your video off. Erin and the team and I are perfectly used to staring at each other, and so we're used to that. And if it makes it easier to focus, on or off is fine. Please use the chat function, as I see some folks already are, which is great, to share questions and feedback throughout the meeting, or ask for the mic when we get to a question and answer session. Our general experience is that after 20 or 30 minutes of us talking, it's not real exciting for people to jump on and suddenly start talking. And so what we're going to ask people to do today is really use chat throughout the presentations. Share your comments, share your questions, share your feedback. We'll be recording and saving that and sort of loading those into a database of ideas, feedback, discussions, comments that we're already building, both on the local options and just general feedback that we've developed or that we've received through these processes. So please do feel free to dive in there. Emily will be keeping an eye on chat, and I imagine others from our team will as well, and we'll try to flag and answer questions that require or suggest an immediate answer. But it's fine to just share commentary and feedback there too. It's your chance to kind of be a little bit of a peanut gallery while we talk here. Relatedly, as Erin and I particularly are talking, we won't be tracking the chat function. Emily will do that and bring stuff to mind for us. So I'm not such a great multitasker that I can present and watch chat at the same time. Feel free to flag Emily down via chat, either private or general channel there if you need help with technical issues. And we are already recording the webinar, and we'll post it on our website as we have other resources and webinars up to this point. So I would say the most common question or comment we got during our virtual flip chart session, which thank you all for your feedback and comments there, was something kind of along the lines of what the heck is going on here and what is this process intended to do and why am I participating in it or why should I participate in it? So Erin and I are going to take a few minutes here to back up, review where we're at. We're not going to present the same darn slides for the most part that we've done in every PowerPoint up till now. We assume folks have the basics, and if not, we have resources on the website that we'll point you to. But we got some fairly pointed questions, which we felt were just totally fair, and appreciate folks flagging for us that perhaps it was not entirely clear what we were aiming to do here. So these were kind of the three most common and I guess most pressing questions that, that the agency team saw in the comments that we've received over the last month or so here. A couple of times a question came up, hey, if this is FEMA's consultation, it's not particularly clear why local governments need to take action. It seems like FEMA has an ESA problem and not local governments here. So I'm going to run through these questions quickly, and then I will ask Erin Cooper from FEMA to help me answer them in kind of an interview style here. The second question that came up quite frequently is, boy, I thought we were heading into a conversation here about the infamous 3 doors that some of you may recognize from the Washington approach, and maybe I was even kind of ready for a battle around that, and then we started talking about local options instead. So when did we make that transition and why? And then there were a handful of folks that in one form or another provided some feedback that I would interpret as like, it kind of feels like we're making a list of things I might not like here, and maybe they're regulations, maybe they're policy options, maybe they're just local government, you know, options for actions. Maybe I don't necessarily agree with this, and I think that's a totally fair question, and we want to clarify why we're collecting this set of ideas, and not that we're just making this enormous catalog of ideas that some people hate and you know, trying to be nefarious or secretive about what we're doing with those next. So as process coordinator and facilitator here, I want to say we had a plan. We thought it was pretty clever. We didn't necessarily communicate it as well as we thought we did. And so we can cause some confusion and some consternation. And we're sorry about that, but we really appreciate folks flagging us down and letting us know through various channels. And we're hoping the information we provide today can help clarify and set us straight here. So Erin, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and take this first question. So if this is FEMA's consultation between FEMA and NOAA Fisheries, why do local governments need to take action at this point or at some point in the future when FEMA releases an implementation plan?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So, right, it's a valid question. And if you think about what got us here, the National Marine Fisheries Service issued a biological opinion and reasonable and prudent alternative for FEMA's implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program, determined that that implementation by FEMA creates jeopardy for listed native fish and other species and can potentially harm their critical habitat. So the result of that consultation means that FEMA needs to change the way that we implement our program. Some of those changes FEMA can and is working to make on our own, specifically related to CRS, some mapping initiatives, and a few other things. But when it comes to the actual floodplain management components of the NFIP, we have to look at the way the National Flood Insurance Program is structured and recognize that the implementation of that federal national program actually happens on the ground by our local participating communities. So in implementing the NFIP, we have to make sure that our local development actions by participating communities don't add up to an overall jeopardy effect on these listed species that were included in the biological opinion. And so we have to make that solution fit into all of the federal frameworks that exist, specifically ESA's Section 7A2, which requires FEMA as a federal agency to ensure that any actions that are performed by our agency, our specific program that was the subject of the biological opinion, are not likely to jeopardize species or impact the critical habitat of those species. So it all comes back to the implementation of the NFIP, but because of the structure of our program, this involves coordination with our local communities in floodplain management on the ground.
Thanks, Erin. And it seems like that cumulative impacts question is a really key one there. So it's not necessarily a question of whether any one community's actions add up to jeopardy, as that the cumulative effects of all of the Oregon NFIP communities need to make sure that they clear that hurdle of not creating jeopardy for the species or harm to its habitat. So I will remind folks too that on our OregonNFIP.org website, we have a bunch of additional resources that cover this topic, maybe even kind of ad nauseum, I would say. So a summary and a FAQ document that we've shared, the recordings of past webinars, links to agency-specific resources, and also there's a feedback link there where you can, in addition to the page where you shared your local options, there's just a generalized link to feedback where you can share questions and concerns with the agency team, and those will go straight to Erin. Erin, are you ready for your next question?
I'm ready.
We have hesitated to start talking about things as doors because, for reasons that you'll describe in a second, door can be both a great explanatory word for folks who are deep in the biological opinions nationally and locally around the NFIP, but they can also be a little bit of a trigger word sometimes. But folks are interested to talk about, hey, I thought I was coming here for a conversation on these three doors, or what the Oregon version of these three doors might be. When did we start talking about local options instead, and why did we start doing that?
Sure. So for a little bit of background, in case somebody isn't super familiar with this door approach, the biological opinion that NOAA Fisheries issued for the Puget Sound region, communities in that region, was broken out into implementation strategies or paths that we refer to as doors. So door one is an approach in which a community uses a model ordinance that FEMA developed with language to meet the ESA requirements of the reasonable and prudent alternative. And communities can just take that model ordinance, adopt it, and if they follow that, they're meeting compliance requirements. Door two is more of an ordinance checklist, and it allows communities to be a little bit more flexible in their ordinance approach than just adopting the model ordinance. It allows communities to identify the resources already at play or language already in their ordinances that meets some of these ESA goals. And then door three is more of a project level assessment of a local community's floodplain management program. And so in this situation, project level means essentially permit by permit. So every time somebody wants to develop in a floodplain, that permit has to show how the project being permitted meets requirements for the Endangered Species Act and does not cause impact to the species or to the critical habitat impacted by that specific project. So what we've heard from you throughout this whole process since the reasonable and prudent alternative was issued back in 2016 was that people don't really want us to go that route in Oregon. You want us to dive into the nuts and bolts of kind of finding a different approach, make sure that that process is clear and objective along the way, with both flexibility and specificity in the options that we put forward. We've heard that people and communities want us to look from a local level up, not a top-down approach, and that's what we're trying to do by having all of this engagement with communities and, as we'll explain later, kind of the census-style meetings that we're going to start having this fall. And you've also told us that there's already a lot of good work that happened back in 2016 and 2017. We should draw from that. We are using the memos that were published and the community feedback that we received at that time to help us continue on with the conversation and the analysis of feedback that we've received over the past few years. We recognize that there are some low-hanging fruit also, and we want to make sure that we can utilize those as much as we can so that we can make this process and the eventual implementation strategies, paths that we put together beneficial both for the ESA component and for our local economies and local floodplain management programs. And finally, we also heard that, FEMA's taken way too long. You guys got to get your act together and keep moving. Well, that's what we're doing as well. So we are in the middle of a 3-year delay period instituted by Congress, but we are getting ready to make sure we have a plan to go forward whenever that delay is over, which is late next year.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I just wanted to chip in too before we move on here that I think the most common thing that we've heard in comments and both in sort of workshop conversations and through stuff submitted through the website is the 3 doors approach won't work for Oregon. So please, make sure there are different or more options there.
Hey, Sarah and Erin.
To reinforce that.
Yeah.
Before we jump ahead, I have one quick question in chat for you. Would project level assessment only occur if the floodplain project is on a salmonid stream?
That's a great question. Because these implementation requirements for FEMA are specific to the National Flood Insurance Program, we're going to be focused on the special flood hazard area and communities that have regulated special flood hazard area. Now, I will say that not every community in the state of Oregon is within the scope of this biological opinion and RPA issued by NOAA Fisheries, but the majority of Oregon communities and tribes are within this geographical area, and that geographical area is primarily bounded by watershed basins throughout the state that have salmonid streams.
Right, or critical habitat for salmonids, right, that are included in the biological opinion. So that, my assumption would be, Erin, that as that was, we don't know whether a project level assessment will be one of the paths that's offered through this through this implementation process, but my assumption would be that in the Puget Sound, that requirement, if folks decided to walk through that door, would be specific to watersheds that lie within critical habitat covered under the biological opinion. And I apologize, I didn't put that that slide with the map in here, but we can pull it up later if needed or share it with folks after the meeting.
And just a last point on that, we can always come back to this later on in the webinar, but that assessment would have the opportunity to show that, say, a stream isn't salmonid habitat and there hasn't been critical habitat there. So if that's the case for a specific project, that project level assessment does have the opportunity to provide those project area specific details.
Yeah, and I will say, Erin, just as I described kind of the primary set of feedback that we've gotten from partners so far has been around those 3 doors. The most questions and concerns also, I would say, just qualitatively have been around that project by project analysis option and how that would work. So we probably just want to emphasize that we're by no means saying that that's what's going to happen in Oregon, just describing the 3 doors that were used in the Puget Sound biological opinion so folks can have a sense of where we're starting this conversation and what we're departing from rather than where we're headed.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided not to start with 3 doors, which turned out to be a contentious choice, Erin.
Yeah, yeah. So instead of starting with that same approach, we wanted to start with what actions really make the most sense at the local level within Oregon communities, and then build up from there using feedback through this process and the previous engagement process led by DLCD.
Great, thank you both.
So that's what we've been working on. Oh, sorry, Emily, did you have another question for us before we move on?
I was getting a couple of follow-ups in chat, which maybe might be answered shortly here by you both, but we're just getting a follow-up to Erin's response of, does the national NEPA process also address other listed species that weren't included in the Oregon BiOp, such as the USFWS listed species? And it would be really helpful to know what exactly a project needs to do to demonstrate exemptions from that criteria.
Great questions. So to address Caitlin's question, a NEPA review process that we go through would be specific to the Oregon biological opinion and our approach to meet the intent of the reasonable and prudent alternative. So it would only be specific to the species listed in our biological opinion, in NOAA Fisheries biological opinion. And for Sarah's question, I think that's the kind of detail that would really come out once we determine if a project level analysis or something similar is a implementation path that's chosen for Oregon communities. And based on that path, we would determine what those exemption criteria would be. So we don't have that level of detail really fleshed out yet.
So I think these next couple of slides can help show a little more show where we're at in this. So with this slide, Erin, we're trying to imagine what the process, or share with folks kind of what's in our head about some future date where FEMA releases an implementation plan. It has specific guidance for Oregon NFIP communities related to the standards or the criteria that you just described. What happens next?
Right, so we are working with communities to figure out what type of implementation paths make the most sense, while also making sure that those paths do allow FEMA to meet the intent of the RPA. And through that process, we're going to explore and identify suitable local options and eventually get ourselves to a group of paths that we feel confident can make an implementation plan that meets the needs of Oregon communities, but also makes sure FEMA knows that we're doing the job we need to do to meet the requirements put forth by NOAA Fisheries in the reasonable and prudent alternative.
So today's conversation, Erin, right, we'll start to dive into kind of sketching out the ideas that we've collected so far in some really limited conversations among the agency team and a couple of comments provided by stakeholders to sort of map out what those implementation paths might look like. Could it include a model ordinance? Could it include a checklist? Could it include completely new ideas? We're just going to kind of throw out in our later conversation here a bunch of ideas and ask for some initial feedback on those, and then continue the conversation next time. The place where we started the conversation with the virtual flip charts, which I think was part of what was confusing to folks, was the second starting to identify suitable local options. And so the idea, right, was to try to start building a storehouse of ideas that people could use when they walk down those paths. But I think we lost our audience there. So hopefully this makes it a little clearer, and then we can kind of reorient ourselves to this figure as we go along and talk about sort of which steps in this implementation process we're imagining when we're asking for feedback on different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're focusing on today.
Yep.
Okay. So nobody actually said this, Erin, but the third question that we kind of derived from some general sense of frustration and informal feedback was, kind of looks like you guys are building a list of things that an individual local government or stakeholder might not be pleased with, might not agree with, might not love seeing 300 of these ideas or 200 of these ideas in the same place. So why don't you talk us through a little bit why we started going down that path?
Sure, and we'll use these handy shirts as a bit of a metaphor foundation to help kind of make sense of all of this. So if you imagine that each of these shirts on your screen is a different participating NFIP community throughout the state, whether you're a tribe, whether you're a city, a county, the state, making everybody wear the same shirt isn't necessarily going to work. So even if we only offered 3 different kinds of shirt, a city shirt, a county shirt, a tribe shirt, that's not still really going to meet all of your needs. Every city is not the same. Every county is not the same. Every tribe's not the same. We don't want everybody wearing ill-fitting shirts or shirts that make you feel uncomfortable. So to make a lot of different shirts work for a lot of different shirt-wearing communities, we're going to need a lot of different material to work with. So we're going to need to take the cloth to make these shirts and use it in creative and different ways to make it work for each of your communities. Whether you, pick your shirt on a screen and tell us in the chat which one you like best, or if one's not there that you like, let us know. So what we're really trying to get here is that if you have more options on the table, we can figure out different ways to use those options to fit the needs of this program and this implementation.
So if everybody's trying to come out of this with an NFIP shirt, or let's say the end result of this is everybody has a shirt that reassures them at the end of the day that local options being taken for managing development and other actions in floodplain are covered under the Endangered Species Act. They're consistent with the Endangered Species Act, and also FEMA's implementation program is consistent with the implementation plan. That's what we're trying to build, right? We're trying to build a bunch of material, a storehouse of knowledge, a storehouse of ideas that we can hand back to communities as a resource, not to make an exhaustive list of every possible regulation and voluntary approach in the world and then make everybody to do all of it. But to make sure that as people are walking down whatever implementation paths seem like they're going to work best for Oregon, that they have as many possible local options, regulatory, voluntary, restoration, mitigation, whatever they might look like, to be able to draw from and figuring out how to head down that path. Is that a fair summary?
I think so, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, we're going to start breaking up into some smaller conversations here over the next month or two. Do you want to give us a little bit more detail on that? And we'll revisit this also towards the end.
Yeah, so today we're still trying to get some high-level feedback, but on some more details of content than we provided in some of our past webinars. So we want to continue to take feedback on these paths that we share with you today into some smaller conversations. We're calling them kind of caucus-style meetings, where we want to talk with specific groups throughout the state, whether we speak with an industry group or the League of Cities or a group of folks representing urban or rural communities. We want to continue having these conversations on a smaller, more intimate scale, and continue working with our core team of agencies to then draft a kind of a better package to present you all with, hopefully in October, where we outline the implementation paths that we think we can really move forward with, and explain the local options that communities can use on those paths, and then figure out a draft of specific needs that each community thinks there might need to be in order to actually make those paths workable in a final plan.
Cool. Okay, so that was our attempt at improving the clarity around what we're describing and what we're aiming for here. Erin, thanks for that. Appreciate the clarification. This is a good point maybe to, if you have any questions immediately on this topic or want to make a quick comment or question to share with the agency team, feel free to share that in chat. And Emily, this would be a great time if there are other kind of questions hanging out there that we want to try to address, then feel free to bring those up. And I'm going to sit here and stare awkwardly at the camera for just a second. Okay, sounds like maybe we got most, oh, there come a few.
Yeah, Sarah, we're getting asked, it seems like this process is very iterative and based on previous steps. Just a great comment, thank you, Sarah. And then Jody's asking, can a community have 2 shirts?
What an interesting philosophical question, Jody. I think, Erin, my inclination is to hold a little bit on that until we get to the paths conversation, which is a little bit further along in the agenda here. But maybe as a little spoiler, it seems likely that one of the paths is could be sort of a make your own adventure, or, hey, you came up with 5 paths, but none of them suit my community. I think that might be the category we'll talk about later on that might be closest to what Jody's describing, which maybe that's not 2 shirts, although maybe you can wear 2 shirts. But maybe it's actually I need a motorcycle jacket or a raincoat or a, bulletproof vest or something. And so let's start a conversation about a different path.
That sounds good. Yeah, so we'll get to that conversation in a minute, Jody.
Okay, Emily, anything else, or should we move on here?
All right, we can move ahead.
Okay, feel free to keep throwing questions and comments in there. All right, I'm going to give Erin a break here, and I'm going to share the results of our virtual flip chart, building, as we described, kind of a menu of local options of actions that could be taken at the local level to meet the goals that Erin described. So if you'll remember this figure, the confusing part, I think, was that we started talking with step 2, which is maybe not normally the logical thing to do. And so our goal here is to identify a whole set, a sort of storehouse of suitable local options that folks could choose from in the implementation planning process here. And to land with a menu of options, and I think maybe sort of considerations about which are likely to work and which might fit some specific challenges for some specific kinds of communities, that we can then kind of think through how do we tie those to each of the potential implementation paths and help provide folks with some more guidance about how to best kind of mix and match these different options. So if folks remember, at the point at which we were asking, we provided kind of an opening presentation and then gave you a couple of weeks to enter information in the virtual flip chart on the OregonNFIP.org website. We proposed 3 buckets, and all 3 borrowed largely from the compensatory mitigation hierarchy that we figured folks would probably be pretty familiar with, and which seemed to kind of cover most of the bases of ideas that we were brainstorming or drawing from the work group results and other sources. Avoidance, avoiding impacts to flood-prone areas altogether, to sensitive flood-prone areas altogether. Minimization, so assuming that some development moves forward, potentially even in this special flood hazard area, how can we minimize the impacts of those actions to key floodplain functions? And then restoration and compensation, so either through a compensatory mitigation program or voluntary restoration efforts or something similar to that, taking actions that would maintain and enhance the floodplain, the natural functions of floodplains. We got some good feedback, and so we're glad that we are building a lot of material and definitely won't have to rely on this particular shirt's material in order to somehow construct a shirt for everybody moving forward so far. And the spreadsheets are still open, the flip charts are still open, by the way, and we're happy to keep collecting these as our conversations go on the next couple of weeks. Thanks very much for those who did weigh in. We had 17 separate respondents. There were folks who put a lot of stuff in those cells, and thank you so much for all the ideas that you provided there. We collected so far 225 distinct ideas. I was up about 8 o'clock this morning. Most of those did come from the virtual flip charts. We did also, as Erin mentioned, bring in some additional ideas from the DLCD memos, a few ideas from the community rating system and the original RPA, some agency team conversations. What we found when we started breaking down those 225 distinct ideas was that there were a good number that clearly did fit in terms of sort of local options for local governments to take or other local NFIP entities to take under each of these buckets. We also noticed that there were a lot of what I would call considerations. There were concerns or red flags or yellow flags, or hey, if you're going to do this, keep this in mind, or hey, we already did this, why are you telling us this is new? So I'll share a lot of those with you today as well. And we also noticed that there was kind of a new bucket that we hadn't really thought about, but that there were quite a few entries for, which are sort of requests for state and federal action. So if I'm going to take some kind of avoidance, minimization, or compensatory mitigation as a local or tribal government or a utility, I would need this state or federal agency to take some other specific action to make that possible. Or, hey, maybe you don't need local governments to take action on this. Maybe what you actually need is federal action. So we added a new bucket for that. And thanks to everybody for sharing their ideas and working with our framework to get your ideas in one form or another. So again, feel free to share, as we're going through this, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat window. And then as we reach the end of this section, I'll ask Emily to chime back in with any questions. If you'd like to speak to the group, then shout out to Emily that you'd like the mic for a few seconds. And then we'll take a break after this section because there's a lot of content here and not a lot of cheery photos of shirts and stuff like that. And I will remind folks we will save the results. We'll save them in an unattributed form, but we'll save all the comments that come in through the chat function today, through the virtual flip chart, everything kind of to our database of feedback, which we'll share back at the end of this process in a synthesized form. So the avoidance bucket and the traditional mitigation hierarchy comes first. And oh, I will share too, I know that folks will have received, actually, let me pull it up here real quick. Folks will have received a PDF from Emily that looks kind of similar to this, only it probably says last updated September 30th. So this is our actual flip charts. This is how we would write them up if they were actual flip charts. We put everything that we could into the categories we started with and made a bunch of subcategories and other buckets, as I said, and so forth. There were a number of folks who added comments via the flip charts last week, and we just got a chance to update and revise those this morning. So apologies to folks who didn't see your feedback included in the version we previously sent out. And once we complete the webinar here within about 24 hours, we'll send out this updated version that includes everything we've received through today. And we go back to the PowerPoint here. So avoidance was the first big bucket, and we kind of started sorting those into big categories of options within our avoidance bucket. So there were a lot around floodway mapping and floodway definitions, a handful of Oregon communities and communities as well outside of Oregon that folks flagged as using these approaches. There are several categories of just kind of stronger development prohibitions within the floodway. So for example, in addition to the existing no rise requirement, completely prohibiting everything except water dependent or water associated uses in the floodway or something like that. Folks shared a whole category of other potential development prohibitions within certain kinds of development to be prohibited within a 10-year floodplain or a channel migration zone or a specific overlay zone. Somebody shared language that would have precluded any development in the in some subset of the SFHA that had any unmitigated impacts, which kind of connects to our mitigation bucket. And there were some ideas around limitations on land divisions, density, rezoning, critical structure siting, and so on and so forth for either all or part of the flood zone. And so this is where I know folks start to get into like heart palpitation category. And so I really want to emphasize the goal here was to collect ideas. We know that no community is going to implement all of these. And frankly, we know that probably some communities might choose to go pretty light on the avoidance actions. But we wanted to collect a library here and make sure that we had enough material to work with. So the idea here is to build a database and have some options so that folks can say, okay, I'm interested in looking at the way floodways are defined or managed or regulated in my community. Who else can I look to? What might I be able to learn about how that might be done if my community chooses to go that route? There were lots of considerations and concerns listed, as you might expect for this category. It was clear that different communities will probably want to focus any avoidance efforts on different parts of the floodplain, that it might make a ton of sense for one community to look at the 10-year floodplain if they have it mapped or not, and perhaps to focus on the floodway if that just makes more sense given the geographic and sort of development limitations of their community. There were a number of folks that shared an opinion that, hey, Oregon has a pretty strong land use planning system, actually, and especially in rural areas. We might already have policies in place that could already preclude development or largely preclude development in the highest risk areas. So please make sure you take a look at that. We got several warnings to be very careful about tripping across Measure 49 claims, about unintentionally sort of snarling folks in a process around buildable and industrial land inventories that might be challenging to work within. And so we can kind of include this in our considerations that we summarize towards the end of this process. We saw requests to watch out for unique types of uses, for infrastructure, for parks, for redevelopment, for water-related uses. There are things clearly that are still going to happen in the floodplain, and maybe even in higher risk areas of the floodplain. And so people wanted to make sure that we were thoughtful, and that any community who's going down one of these paths is thoughtful about different kinds of uses, and not just imagining, do you build a house or do you not build a house in a certain area of the special flood hazard zone. And folks noted as well, you know, there's something about the idea of avoiding impacts to flood prone areas that kind of turns Oregon's land use system upside down. So the main function of the land use system in many ways has been to constrain development within urban growth boundaries. And if we're now saying, no, we're going to carve out these whole areas under some kind of avoidance measure, that we're just not going to allow development there, that's going to create, both for our buildable land inventories and our UGB expansion and all kinds of other processes, kind of some messiness, because that's probably land that through our land use planning system at the local level has been attributed to some other use or designated for some other use up to this point. So that was a warning and a consideration that several folks flagged. I'm going to continue to work my way through the other buckets here. I recognize this is a lot of content. We'll certainly share the slides afterwards, and I just want to remind folks, the point is to kind of get ourselves on a shared footing here so that we can have a conversation. We certainly will leave some time for conversation, and feel free to add thoughts through the chat. But we're just kind of trying to get a shared download here, so we're starting from the same place and some smaller conversations going forward, as Erin said. In minimization, in that bucket, we saw some big categories of actions around, certainly many folks that mentioned various strategies to limit fill in part or all of the floodplain. Several folks shared open space requirements or resource protection zones of various kinds in their own communities, and we kept a catalog of communities that you all pointed to, so we can share those examples in the future. Several folks shared their own design standards, or might include low impact development, green infrastructure, impervious surface limitations. We were already aware from earlier conversations amongst our agency team of a handful of those that different Oregon communities are already using. So that is certainly one mechanism to minimize the impacts to floodplains, to floodplain functions. There was a strong recommendation in particular out of the previous DLCD work group, but also with some of the most recent round of comments to build on or use existing stormwater processes and not imagine that we're starting stormwater regulation from scratch, and to make sure that we're figuring out if communities need to take additional actions within stormwater management to fit that within the existing structure and regulatory process, and also to take a serious look at whether, especially for MS4 communities, the existing set of sort of regulations around that actually might be sufficient to achieve the outcomes of the biological opinion. Several folks shared the idea of vegetated buffers, preservation standards, some kind of ways of protecting vegetation very close into the to water bodies and within the SFHA. Shared either their existing code or just ideas about how that might work. One idea that somebody shared was to apply the flood code to a broader area. So the limitations that currently apply within the NFIP's minimum standards could theoretically be applied to a broader area, although I don't believe it's within FEMA's ability to mandate that. Their area of reference is the SFHA. But if someone chose to to limit impacts into a broader area, the argument that we saw submitted was that should count towards sort of adding up the debits and credits and assessing how they're impacting natural floodplain functions and fish habitat. Somebody also shared the idea of doing a type 3 review for new structures in the SFHA. So to some extent, just limiting and taking a greater opportunity to minimize impacts with a closer look at development and the standards that that's reviewed against. We got relatively few considerations or concerns listed in the minimization section. Seems a little bit less contentious anyway than the avoidance section. One person flagged, and this makes a ton of sense to me as somebody who lives in a rural area, that a lot of minimization measures, especially around stormwater, are really designed for urban areas, and that minimization measures designed for urban systems don't necessarily make sense or apply well in rural areas. They might not even be appropriate. And folks also said, once again, please don't try to reinvent the wheel on stormwater. It's not going to end well. So this is my third from last category. Compensation and compensatory mitigation and restoration more generally, we've kind of lumped into a single category. Might want to split those out in the future. It seems like compensatory mitigation and restoration were two categories that folks had a lot to say about. And I guess I would say, just sort of from, as the person who helped kind of analyze and sort through all these entries, this is when you start to get a little bit more popular, a little bit less contentious. Folks want to dive into the details of what this would look like. But it's maybe not quite as contentious as some of the earlier sections, but still a lot to talk about still. So certainly many folks mentioned the possibility of doing compensatory mitigation for flood storage, for impervious area or stormwater impacts, and for vegetation. As kind of a habitat feature and also as part of flood mitigation. A number of folks mentioned the possibility for some kind of fee-based or programmatic system, some kind of offsite stormwater fee or an in lieu fee program for compensatory mitigation for those functions, some kind of development impact fee that could be then directed towards helping to do restoration that can make sure that the flood functions come out in the black, so to speak. A lot of folks mentioned restoration of various kinds, stream enhancement, estuary enhancement, fish habitat, tide gates, culverts. There's a lot to do out there, a lot of existing sources of funding, a lot of projects out there, and a lot of folks interested in performing that work. Folks mentioned voluntary programs to address non-conforming uses, so past uses that have been grandfathered in under current regulations. If there's an opportunity to provide some funding to address things that are currently in the floodplain and or affecting functions, then that could be a way that a community could help make this work. Green space and parks, and in particular, sort of local government actions to establish green spaces and parks as a major way of mitigating and compensating for impacts to flood storage. Also a great way to make sure that the floods have someplace to go while they're coming through. And several folks mentioned acquisitions, either by private or public entities. So a willing buyer program, which we know a couple different communities in Oregon have done either pre or post disaster, or I guess a lot of times you're kind of in both of those categories. Post disaster buyouts, green space again, parks, land swaps, so on and so forth. So there are a lot of different things here. And again, we may want to kind of break those out for our next set of conversations to be able to dive into a little bit more detail, both on compensation and restoration. Some of the concerns or considerations folks wanted to highlight in this category. A lot of folks said they'd like both some flexibility, but also some clear guidance potentially at the state level for how compensatory mitigation should work. There seemed to be, although I don't know that anybody said this directly, there seemed to be a strong sense of like, let's not ask every local community to figure out how to do compensatory mitigation for these functions by themselves. Folks mentioned the importance of using a mitigation hierarchy. Obviously, if you start by trying to avoid impacts, then you'll have less mitigation burden at the end of that hierarchy, and less impact overall. There was another reminder to watch mitigation requirements and the way that they might apply to and potentially disincentivize parks, ag-related uses, infrastructure, water-related uses. Folks particularly called out, hey, don't assume that agricultural lands are just going to be a logical place to put implementation sites, because there are quite a few complexities around that, both from a land use and just from a sort of practical farming perspective. And several folks mentioned the importance of implementing and actually counting towards sort of consistency with the biological opinion, existing mitigation requirements that a lot of communities already have on the books. I believe this is my last category, and then we'll ask for some feedback and sort of any quick reflections. Big categories of options that came up at state and in terms of state and federal actions that folks were requesting, and we've certainly passed these on to our state and federal partners for them to contemplate. Again, the idea of the state developing some kind of compensatory mitigation framework to help guide that at the local level for communities that might choose that path. We had a lot of folks, both through this flip chart and past engagements, remind us FEMA is doing a lot of things in our communities and with wearing one hat or another. So please remember to, whatever comes out of this, coordinate and streamline with other FEMA stuff, as well as other sort of state and federal regulatory frameworks, which is flagged a little bit in the next bullet point there. We had folks say, hey, it's really regulation of wetlands or regulation of ag practices or regulation of stormwater that you should be focusing on, and maybe floodplains isn't necessarily the right place to be trying to solve this problem specifically and sort of solely related to development impacts of the floodplain. There were a lot of requests for dollars and a lot of recognition that, especially if we want to have a more restoration-focused approach, there's a really significant need for investment, even at a time at which obviously lottery dollars and other sources of conservation funding are becoming quite challenging to come by. A lot of requests for mapping and a lot of clear feedback that if FEMA expects anybody to take actions according to a new mapping category or a new definition of mapping or new types of mapped areas like the 10-year floodplain, please do it. Please don't expect local governments to step up and do that one by one. We had folks mention the idea of pulling into place a sort of integrated set of statewide restoration priorities and how looking at the problem of floodplain function through a somewhat larger lens and sort of stream restoration, river restoration from a somewhat larger lens could really help us identify priorities where we want to focus statewide on restoration or within a watershed or a local area. And finally, there were a lot of requests, whatever comes out of this process, for technical assistance. As I said earlier, as Erin was speaking about Washington's 3 doors, probably the bulk of these comments focused around this idea that if there's going to be a permit by permit impact assessment route, any community that went through that route would need some clear guidance and support on impact assessment and understanding how that would work and how they could be sure that they were doing that appropriately and had the resources to do so appropriately in their community. And I've been talking for a real long time, so Erin, I thought this might be, before we totally change the topic here, this might be a good idea for you to step in and share one action that a federal agency is taking, not as a result of this consultation, but at least relevant to it. Can you tell us a little bit about the I guess we're calling it the BRIC program? That sounds suspiciously development oriented, but please go ahead.
Right, and I wanted to mention this during this webinar to bring it to everybody's attention that FEMA has released a first notice of funding opportunity for a new grant program, a mitigation grant program called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. If you're familiar with FEMA's mitigation grant programs, this is eventually replacing the pre-disaster mitigation grants and expanding it. And one component of the funding opportunity that I wanted to encourage you all to look more into, and again, I'll mention local governments and state agencies apply as sub-applicants to the state. So it's a complicated process to get the funding, but there is funding available for supporting community capability and capacity building. And those could be opportunities that communities use down the road to help build up your floodplain management programs to be more fish friendly in a way. I wanted to mention it so that people are aware. Go to fema.gov/BRIC for the pages and information all about this new program. There's a series of videos, recorded webinars that are available on FEMA's YouTube page as well. And if we send out slides with these links later, you'll be able to access that information. So check it out. I'm not the expert to answer any questions about it, but if you go to the FEMA website, you'll be able to find those who can answer those questions. Or ask me and I'll find out the answer for you.
Thanks, Erin. So that was a lot of content. And Erin, while you were talking, I took the liberty of flipping through the chat just a little bit here, and it looks like there was a little conversation about type review process, and also a question about Dogami and DLCD's recent landslide hazards land use guide for Oregon communities that I wonder if we might want to, so Linda, are you available to talk to us a little bit? I think the question underlying Melissa's question here is, or the idea underlying Melissa's question here might be, there's some guidance related to that landslide hazard land use guide that sort of explicitly addresses the Measure 49 implications. So Linda, are you able to weigh in on that at all?
This is something that, as the comment kind of alludes to, that we could look at definitely when we look at the different buckets or the different options and seeing how they could fall under the protecting public health umbrella and provide some guidance or some information about, I'm not sure about case law since I'd have to look at that, but definitely some kind of direction from DLCD on that in regards to whatever options are developed, kind of like we did for the landslide hazards guide. So I don't have a clear answer right now, but it's something we can respond to folks on when we do a little bit more research on it. And part of that's when we're a little bit more clear on what the specific options would be, because depending on the option, it might fit a little differently in that definition.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Linda. I want to flip back real quick here because I realize this has just been like a very difficult body of stuff to both deliver and probably receive verbally. We will be sending back out the updated version of this PDF. It includes, I mean, y'all can send us a comment if we're wrong, but I think it includes absolutely everything that was submitted in one form or another. I removed duplicates and split stuff into individual comments. But other than that, it should include everything that we received, every comment we received through the virtual flip chart process, plus, as I said, other ideas collected from the DLCD work groups and other conversations there. And so, as Erin described earlier, our hope is that folks will have a chance to take a close look at this, and then we'll break into, over the next several weeks, smaller group conversations, because as we're seeing here through sort of chat participation and folks wanting to take the mic from me, it's just really hard to discuss this level of detail with a group of even 35. Whoa, it's going down minute by minute, 33 people. And so we have a whole bunch more content to talk about today. We're going to suggest taking a quick break here because I've been talking so long, and I'm sure everybody could use both a brain break and a bio break. But I really encourage and invite folks to have a look at that handout when it's developed. We'll be sharing those results with everybody in this group, updating them periodically as we get new ideas added. And we'll also be sharing them with folks that we might include, that anybody that joins a smaller group conversation with us over the next couple of weeks and to maybe a month and a half here. All right. So I'm not seeing a ton of other comments or questions in the chat function. I'm going to propose, it's 2 o'clock. I'm going to propose we take a, I hate to do this, but I'm going to propose we take a 5-minute break, folks, because we still want to make sure we get through the paths and next steps here. I think we'll be fine, but I don't want to cut us short. So let's take a 5-minute break. Feel free to walk away from your computer, stare out the window, go get yourself another cup of coffee. And when we come back, Erin will be talking about the the BiOp implementation paths that we described earlier, that we're starting to map out as many alternatives as we can think of that might be the Oregon equivalent of the 3 doors, even though people probably don't want us to call it that. So I'm going to turn off my camera. I'm going to be back here in 5 minutes at 2:06, and I invite you to do the same. Thanks, and we'll talk to you in a few minutes. Well, friends, 5 minutes passed very quickly. It's 2:06 already. The good news is I'm done talking for a while. My colleague Erin gets to come back for a while. But I'm going to put us back on the PowerPoint here, and I'm going to do that very slowly. All right. As Erin and I described earlier, we're interested now in an initial conversation and just kind of dipping our toes in a topic that we know folks some NFIP BiOp veterans have been waiting for a pretty long time, of what paths to implementation might look like. We decided that if we keep calling it doors, we're going to keep communicating the idea that we're doing the exact same thing as Puget Sound, and that clearly doesn't resonate with people. So we're going to call them paths, test that out, and also see if using the word path allows us to come up with some creative ideas so that we're not leaning on the exact same 3 opportunities or options that FEMA used in the last biological opinion in Puget Sound. But we're really kind of building from scratch and thinking about what's going to work well with Oregon's land use system, with the specific set of local communities that we have engaged here in Oregon, and with the flood and sort of natural and development landscapes that we find ourselves within. So Erin's going to describe some ideas that we've collected or brainstormed so far, and then we're going to share a little bit of a quick live poll here to just get a quick read on folks' kind of general sense of the options we've developed so far. And then again, we're going to take these ideas to smaller group conversations over the next few weeks. Erin, you want to take it away here?
Yeah, and we'll just remind folks that if you have thoughts as I'm going through this, definitely put them in the chat. We'll pull feedback from the chat, but we'll also stop to have a discussion toward the end. So as Sarah said, I'm going to kind of go through some ideas for paths. Some of these do look a little bit similar to kind of what we talked about when we were talking about the doors earlier, but I want to make sure that we talk about these path options in an Oregon context. So I'll just real quick go back to that. I also want to recognize that, as Sarah said earlier, we started in a weird place. We kind of started more in the second box you see on this graph as opposed to the first. Nope.
Sorry, I muted you. I was trying to mute myself. That was my bad. Apparently, this is my first Zoom meeting.
So we're taking a step back in order to go forward again a little bit, but hopefully this will help kind of solidify our approach a little bit more. So let's dive in. So first on this list is a model ordinance approach. And this is focused on making updates to the existing Oregon model flood ordinance. That would be state level to ensure that there is consistency with FEMA ESA requirements for communities who choose this approach. So that's idea number 1. Second is another approach to an options checklist, whereby the checklist outlines the needed outcomes to meet these ESA requirements. And communities can use their local options or existing local frameworks to show how the community is getting to these ESA requirements with maybe some new adoptions, but maybe everything needed to get there is already adopted by the local community. And this checklist will help you show that. Another option would be more of a community-wide plan. You could also think of this as a program level analysis. So a community would outline all of their existing actions, the proposed actions. So maybe big projects that are going through a conditional letter of map review process right now, or development that the community foresees happening in these special flood hazard areas or in these critical habitat areas. And the community plan would show how this existing and proposed development action would have an impact on species and habitat. Next would be kind of what we were discussing earlier. Like Jody asked, this could have 2 shirts in an approach to a project level analysis. Well, I guess that's more of the next example. So we'll stick with project level analysis for right now. Essentially, it's showing project by project, which would eventually likely be permit by permit, how the development would impact the overall critical habitat or listed species in that project area. And with this instance, the project level assessment would be most likely part of a permit process for each community. Okay, so next option is demonstrated limited impact. And here we would rely on kind of a build out analysis that shows how potential for new development in a community may impact species and may have very little impact on species based on that build out analysis if it shows limited impact to critical habitat and species. Another option, here's the way the two shirts might be able to fit into these different paths. By choosing your own adventure, wearing two shirts instead of just one, you might be able to lay out a framework and present it to FEMA as an option for meeting your ESA requirements in a unique way. Examples for this path are examples that communities will come up with and bring to us for review. So ultimately the goal is to establish an alternative process that your community will be able to comply with and show to FEMA that you are meeting your floodplain management requirements through a unique approach. And then of course, if you have any other ideas beyond choosing your own adventure, beyond anything that we are able to creatively bring to the table, we want to hear about it. And we want to see if your ideas might be able to fit into this framework.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So this was a list that the agency team brainstormed, and we are only so many people. And so our assumption is that it might be a good idea to kind of float our first draft list by this group, and recognize that there are probably some great ideas that are not represented here, but at least get a little bit of a temperature check on which of these seem to different folks, especially I think we're thinking here of folks who represent local governments or others who would be implementing this route, which ones would work, which ones would not work, which ones are crazy. So my colleague Emily is going to launch a little live poll here via Zoom, and we're going to ask you for each of the paths that we just outlined, which would you, okay, I have trouble with the like usual categories of polls. So which would you find preferable? Which would you find acceptable? Which would you not be super excited about, but maybe could live with? And which are just like, dude, that's just totally not cool. And so recognizing there are a bunch of folks on the call that don't represent local governments, I imagine folks may have opinions on these as well. So Emily, are you ready to launch the poll? And I'll leave this list of ideas up. And we'll give folks a couple of minutes. First, we'll give Emily a second to launch the poll. There we go. There it goes. Folks, we really appreciate your feedback. This isn't your only chance for feedback, but it's a discussion starter and a chance for us to calibrate our stuff before we start the smaller group conversations. So I'm going to mute myself for a minute or two here so I don't keep babbling, and we'll be right back with you. Okay, Emily, we've got about half of folks having voted here, so I'm going to give them a few more minutes. As a co-host of the meeting, I get to watch the numbers update live, and so I'm very tempted to try to share that with folks as soon as possible. But we'll give it another 2 minutes here, and please do vote, or or we'll give you a couple more minutes, I guess.
Sarah, this is a great question in chat right now that might help others answer the poll. The question is, under option 5, has there been any thoughts as to how often a community would have to do this, once and done or every few years?
Boy, I haven't thought about that at all. We just kind of came up with the idea. Does anybody else from the agency team, Erin or Celinda or anybody else, want to weigh in on that? If folks were expected to show that they just didn't have any significant development potential in the floodplain, how often we'd expect them to re-up the analysis?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I guess we haven't gone into the details of thinking about that aspect of number 5 yet, but I appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
I guess you certainly wouldn't want to do it any more often than that build out potential would actually change. So you might want to set, for example, some kind of trigger criteria that would suggest a reanalysis might be needed, so that if nothing's changing in a community, if it's fully built out or something like that, you wouldn't be making people jump through a hoop every X number of years. Okay, we've got 18 of 30 here. I think it looks like the voting has slowed down, and I recognize that some folks may just not be super excited about voting on these questions. So Emily, how about if we go ahead and close the poll and then you show results, right, when you do that? Yeah, thanks. So this is the closest I've ever had to a Miss America moment, and so I'm going to just milk it for all it's worth here. It's interesting to see the results here. We didn't get a lot of totally not cool votes, which is kind of exciting to see. We didn't get a ton of preferable votes either. I was kind of surprised. You'll see pretty strong result here for the model ordinance. Although there's some meh around the model ordinance, which it's a model ordinance, so what are you going to do? Folks felt generally it seems pretty comfortable with the options checklist, strong, pretty good preferable or acceptable numbers for the idea of a community plan. Project level analysis is not our winner here today, which we kind of already suspected, but it's good to know that a number of folks might consider that acceptable. Jody, when you asked your question about 2 shirts, I think this was kind of what Erin and I were imagining, was like, what if we talked about this a little bit with the agency team quite a while ago, just in banding around ideas. What if a local government had a really limited amount of development potential in the floodplain and said, hey, we're going to sort of demonstrate how limited that impact is, but then set in place a project level analysis requirement, just recognizing that, hey, that might be 1 or 2 or 1 a year projects or something like that. But it seemed like, just from our sort of contemplation, and this is something we'd sure love to hear feedback from folks, that project level analysis choice might be more interesting to communities that just didn't have a lot of volume in terms of development permits in the floodplain. Looks like some interest in the demonstrating limited impact, which is consistent with the idea a lot of folks shared on the flip chart, that maybe Oregon's existing land use regulations actually cover more of this than FEMA or NOAA Fisheries might have thought at first glance. And some interest in the choose your own adventure, but also some lack of interest in the choose your own adventure, which it's an ill-defined choice, so that's totally fair. It looks like nobody has off the top of their head other ideas. So I'm going to return to the slides here. Thanks everybody for voting, and we'll keep the results of that as well. I'm going to return here and share a little bit about what we have imagined having in conversations going forward. Erin and I mentioned that we're hoping to have some smaller group conversations to get a little deeper in these discussions. We thought it might be more comfortable for folks to sort of be large governments sitting together, smaller city governments and county governments sitting together, maybe conservation-oriented groups sitting together, maybe development or ag resource type groups sitting together. I meant development and ag separately, but it's up to you. And we have questions that, like, try as I might, I could not figure out how to fit into a live poll or a 30-person webinar around these ideas that Erin shared. So, like, what are the pros and cons of the different paths? What different kinds of stakeholders might prefer or not prefer? Not just not just governments, but anybody who might be interacting in one way, shape, or form with these paths going forward. What kind of communities might prefer or not prefer each path? We assume there would be quite a bit of difference. And if we understand that, for example, small governments are much more likely to choose, option X, then we can map out the guidelines and the resources available in a way that make that sort of easier to navigate. We're interested in returning to this question that came up in the state and federal actions conversation of what resources would be needed to make each path viable. We've heard a ton from folks about needs. If a project level analysis path went forward, we'd need to know who's allowed to do that analysis, what the standards are, what the quantification methods are, who's a qualified, reviewer, and so forth. So our assumption is each of these paths comes with some specific needs for guidance or technical assistance or funding or mapping or something. And we want to really take the time at this stage to map what those are. And we said we're interested in framing these out in kind of an options and considerations format. So as many paths as we feel like can get us to a viable outcome, let's just map those out and then have considerations to help guide communities that are trying to decide which path to take. So those are the questions that will come. We encourage folks to start thinking about them now. We'll send out, also in the next week or two here, a little handout summarizing the path options we've thought of so far. And in these smaller conversations, we'll share those resources along with the local options and ask folks for feedback on that. We're at another pause. We have just a few minutes left, and really the only slides we have left to talk through here are just sort of our content on process going forward, which we've already hinted very strongly at, so I imagine we can move through that pretty quickly. But I want to pause for just a moment, give folks an opportunity to add questions, clarifications, concerns, red flags in your chat function if you have any of those to share. And Emily, I think I've lost track of chat again. Was there any specific question that came up in the process there that we should address right now?
Nothing specific, just some good comments.
Great. Looking forward to working through those afterwards. Erin, you want to tell us what's next?
Sure. So
a little bit of a reminder at this point.
Yeah, as Sarah alluded to, our next steps are having these smaller caucus conversations in which we can get into the nitty-gritty of some of those questions that we just looked at. What are the pros and cons? What would it take to actually make this implementation path work? Those sorts of questions. And then we'll crosswalk these different paths with local options to try to put together a better, bigger package that we can provide down the road this fall for more specific stakeholder feedback. This will be feedback on the specific implementation paths and the options that different communities can take to use or follow those paths. And then some kind of framework that shows how those local options and the paths intersect, and a draft list of all those specific needs that we're really going to have to address in order to make the final implementation paths work for various communities. And so those conversations, again, are going to kind of talk about a summary of what we've talked about today and ask for feedback on specific local options. Really ask questions about how these different paths relate to a different community, or how these different paths will impact various industries, what's going to need to be built in to make them work, and other options and considerations that we should be considering along the way. We're hoping to have a variety of these conversations, so if we haven't reached out to you yet, expect to hear from us soon. We're looking to talk with local governments from urban communities, rural communities, coastal, inland, tribal communities. We want to know how special districts and utilities, as well as development, construction, real estate, housing groups, kind of see our approach to these paths. Environmental and environmental restoration groups as well, ag, forestry, you name it. If there's somebody who you think we haven't reached out to, definitely let us know, or have them reach out to us and say, hey, we want to be part of the party too. So we're really trying to still get as many perspectives as we can, but in these more one-on-one, smaller conversations.
Yeah, so Erin, I forgot to mention earlier, I think the plan here will be we're coordinating with a handful of specific groups that can help us convene these caucus conversations and make sure that we're including stakeholders that might be interested that might not be on our current list, or we just might not be on their radar yet. But we'll also invite everybody to these and put them on the website. They're not at all private conversations. They're more just sort of focused. So if a local government wants to come to a special district conversation, that's the one you can happen to make it to, no problem. We'll just try to sort of steer the conversation in a way that's receptive to a particular stakeholder group and focus on priorities of that group. Everybody's invited to any of these. So it's not meant to be a private party. Rather, it's supposed to create some smaller conversations that actually make them accessible to a larger group of people, or a larger universe of people, I suppose you might say. So we're already working with League of Oregon Cities, and we'll reach out to Association of Oregon Counties and Association of Clean Water Agencies and other folks to sort of start scheduling and maybe kind of co-hosting these, just to make sure that we can kind of get the broadest net we possibly can. And then you've already explained most of this calendar, but since we'd already moved through a fair bit of it, I just wanted to put it all in one place.
Yeah, so over the next couple of months, we're going to be having these small group discussions and putting together a more detailed package of these implementation paths. And then this fall into the winter, we're going to be revising those documents to really pull together kind of a first draft of a full plan. So we're looking forward to seeing what that's going to look like. And then, of course,
I guess I can take off my little note on in-person workshops there probably at this point, huh?
Yeah, no more in-person workshops for this foreseeable future. And I know we had a question about the NEPA process before. I'll just mention again that we're not going to be entertaining a NEPA process or review of this until we have what we can consider an implementation plan that is ready for that. And that's likely not going to be until this coming spring.
Great, thanks, Erin. I noticed a couple of things come up in chat, and by my phone, we've got negative number of minutes here. But real quick, I just wanted to take a second to address, and certainly folks are welcome to drop off if they need to. And thank you for joining us today, by the way, if you do drop off. Amanda Ferguson mentioned on the checklist option, would the options be ranked weighted? City would have to get a certain number of points, select certain options, or do we have any sense of how that would work to kind of combine different options to meet the checklist? Any ideas, Erin?
Not specific ideas. I think that those are great suggestions.
Yeah, we've been kind of thinking really along similar lines so far, and kind of wondering maybe something for the smaller conversations is what works and doesn't work for folks about the CRS process, which does a similar sort of point system, but it seems like it's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. And so could we take something like that made a simple rubric or a simple point system, but somehow make it more accessible or easier to interact with?
I guess one thing we have been talking about is potentially using that mitigation framework as one component of a weighting system, whether something fits into a avoidance bucket, a minimize bucket, a compensate bucket, but that doesn't fully get us there. So
yeah, I think it'll need some more discussion for sure. And then Sarah Bruce also added, and we can discuss this amongst the agency team as well, that it would be helpful to kind of get a sense of the stressors that need to be addressed, and DLCD and FEMA could help by providing some boilerplate purpose language that communities could use if they're doing ordinance adoption, which I can definitely add to the list of suggested resources or requests.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Well, Erin, you want to say thanks to the folks, or you want me to do it, or both?
We can both do it. I'll start. Again, thanks to everybody who stayed on for the whole webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk through this process with us. We know some of this is maybe a little confusing, and some of this might be moving at a pace that doesn't quite fit how you're envisioning the process moving forward. But if you're able to stick with us, we really are hoping that whatever we come up with is something that meets these needs and the realities of working communities that we've been trying for so many years to really pull together. So thanks for spending your afternoon with us.
Yeah, I'll just second that and let folks know you keep an eye out for sort of paper, or I guess PDF versions of materials on some of the ideas we shared here today for you to contemplate and provide feedback either through this email or through our small group conversations going forward. Thanks again for your time, and stay tuned also for invitations to smaller group meetings over the next couple of weeks. Thanks very much for your time, everybody. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.